You're waiting for like let's say that this was coming out of the Lions game and we were like, oh, you got 5 injured starters on defense. You're waiting for them to get healthy. Those feel like fixes that can happen in a season or things that you can do. Roster problems? How do you fix roster problems? So let's talk about whether or not it is a roster problem, how they got here, what we think about this team's roster and where they may have missed a step. And then the second half of this conversation, we'll talk about how they fix it. So I'll start with an obvious question. Do you see the Seahawks as having a roster problem?
Yeah, any team that's 3-3 doesn't have the roster necessary to win. The only team I'm looking at that has a bad record, and I go, oh, they still might make the playoffs, are the Bengals, just because of Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase. Yeah, like, okay, we've seen them start 1-3. Now, this is a different kind of start, but I look at them and I go, they might be able to figure it out. Why? Because of that roster. Their defense needs to get better. But I'm looking at what they have on offense and Joe Burrow in the game, and I go, they might be able to do it. I look at the Seahawks and I go, there probably is a roster issue going on here. And we haven't seen Abe Lucas. I think that is huge to what this team wants to do. Having Abe and Charles Cross on your ends, at your tackles, definitely what you would prefer to see. But I'm starting in the trenches because this team's not able to run the football or stop the run. It's all about the big boys, okay? So we're looking at Connor Williams, who's a veteran that you brought over here. Signed a 1-year deal. Obviously, you're not committed to him. You brought over Laken Tomlinson. Brought him over from the Niners or the Jets?
Laken Tomlinson, Jets, both.
But last team was the Jets, right? You brought him over, 1-year deal. We'll see what happens there. And then it almost feels like Anthony Bradford has kind of been forced into this position. You drafted Christian Haynes, and he's just not ready to go yet. These guys are saying he's still got to grow with some technique and all that other stuff. You did address the offensive line even more in the draft with LeMayu as well. And then the part that really signifies this offensive line like being in a little bit of trouble is the drop of Oluwatimi. Like Oluwatimi was supposed to be the next guy up at the center spot. You draft him out of Michigan. He sits for a year. Hopefully he learns. But you don't have a lot of faith in what's happening over there, at least not right now. Maybe he's a year or two away. You bring Connor, and then Jalen Sundell has kind of been promoted in front of Oluwatimi as well. Don't know what's going on. I'm not at practice, but just looking at the way things have been moving, you look at the O-line and say they clearly don't have the 5 guys they want out there consistently, at least not right now. That's where coaching comes in. You can take a player to another level, but there's only so far that player is going to go because of mental capabilities, physical capabilities. It just is what it is. That's no knock on that person, but there's a reason why, like I said last week, why guys only last 3.5 years in this league, because it's hard to sustain success at any level, at any position. I think when it comes to the outside, I'm focusing on offense right now. Yeah. It comes to the receivers. I think in theory, you have 3 receivers who can get it done. You have a DK Metcalf who's coming off his worst game, who has some things he needs to work on. You got JSN, who's kind of just been floating around because that's really what his role is right now. And you have Tyler Lockett, who's shown that he can be a 2 or a 3 depending on the day or the time. None of this works. And then you have a Geno Smith who's coming off of his worst game, right? And 2 running backs, so I think you put them in the 49ers offense, they're probably breaking off 76 yards runs like the homie Grondo or whatever his name was. None of this works without the bigs, though. Yeah, you can have a quarterback in Geno who I think is good enough to win you some games if surrounded by the right people. You can have receivers who I feel like are capable of making big plays. DK's shown that back-to-back 100-yard games. Needs to work on some stuff. Everyone does. But if you don't have no bigs, it ain't going to work. So is there a roster problem? Yeah. Is it a roster combination? Is it talent? That's for the coaches to figure out.
Exactly. It's like the problem with this team it's not that they're a bad roster, but the best pieces of the roster are perimeter players or skill position players and guys that aren't going to be drastically, you know what I mean? Like they are dependent on a better offensive line, essentially, or a defensive line that isn't banged up or underperforming. I think that, Curtis pointed this out in the Sports Pit, so I'm stealing the start of this. It was a really good point. Curtis, you pointed out that you felt like Seahawks fans had seen a version of building a Super Bowl roster that just isn't actually something that many people can do.
Yeah, it's incredibly difficult to, year after year after year in the draft, hit on all these late-round picks that became not just like couple-year starters, but became franchise pillars, that became all-pros, future Hall of Famers. You had Bobby in the second round, Russ in the third round, KJ in the fourth, Sherman and Cam were in the fifth round.
You traded a fourth-rounder for Marshawn Lynch.
None of that happens regularly in the NFL.
Right.
Like, that is just, a weird, wild set of circumstances that the Seahawks were able to take advantage of. Not saying that, they didn't have intel on these guys and they had, spotlighted them in their college careers and were like, yeah, we're going to go after them. But like, that just doesn't happen every single season in the NFL.
Well, and when you look at talent around the NFL, Myles Garrett, number 1 overall. Nick Bosa, number 2 overall. You can look at top 10 picks in the NFL, and you'll find a Roquan Smith, Sauce Gardner, Josh Allen. You know what I mean? Patrick Mahomes just out of it, or maybe 10 overall. But either way, you are going to find blue chip talent, and it is just easier. It is easier to hit on that talent when you're drafting in the first round and early first round. And because all of us can think of late round picks that have worked out or of first round picks who've been busts, it's really easy to go, well, oh, no, you can find talent anywhere. You can't. And this also is not me making an excuse for John Schneider or the Seahawks front office and saying like, oh, well, they haven't had a lot of top 5 picks, so that's why. Well, no, but the problem is when you win consistently, and when you aren't finishing 4th in the NFC West for consecutive seasons or for 4 seasons in a row, you need to find creative ways to build your roster. They had a lot of success with that early and have struggled with it of late.
It's not just like build a bear. You walk into the store, you build the bear you want, you put the right clothes on it, you walk out, it's ready to go. You gift it. Now it's build a roster, and building a roster is tough. And I would say they have hit on some. JSN for a number 20 pick, I think he's moving in the right direction. He's doing exactly what he's supposed to do. Charles Cross, what was he pick, 9? 9? I think he's doing exactly what he's going to do. You hit on Abe Lucas. He just hasn't been available or healthy. Defensively, Devin Witherspoon, completely fine with how he's been producing. Reek Woolen, if he was healthy, or a 5th-round pick, completely fine there. So they hit on all those other players, in my opinion. I'm sure there are going to be some people who disagree. Boya Mafe, I feel like they hit on that too. That's how hard it is to build a roster. You can hit on 5 or 6 guys. You need 22, really like 32 of them things out there who can rotate in and keep things going. Byron Murphy, before he got hurt, was moving in the right direction. So it's a slow build. It's not a 1-year type of thing, especially when you're bringing in a new coordinator with a new defense who's probably going to look for different type of players than you were looking for with Pete Carroll. Not an excuse, just the reality. So they've hit on some pieces. They have some expensive pieces that are going to affect the cap next year. You have some rentals, I feel like, on that offensive line. They're making moves, but when you have teams like the Niners who have lost for a while, who got all their picks and some acquisitions, we have the Lions who have hit. You're trying to catch them, and they've had a head start because they were worse at times than you were, and have established a culture and have a coach in Dan Campbell who's been there for a while and Shanahan who's been there for a while. It's just a different type of race. So the roster does need to be fixed. If this roster didn't need to be fixed and we say, bring everyone back next year, you'll be good to go. Nah, you're not even going to have everyone start. Whoever started last game, I guarantee you there's going to be some changes this next game. That is the rat race, which is building an NFL roster. It's just it's unfortunate when you feel like you look at some pieces and say, okay, these guys are good to go, but it takes everybody.
The second part of this conversation that we'll jump into now is how you fix a roster problem, because how you fix a problem of a player underperforming is like, oh, you bench that guy. But how do you fix a problem of just not having the talent that like other top contending teams do? I don't think anyone is raising their hands going, oh, tank. Just be really bad, and then you can get Penei Sewell really high, like the Lions did. Then you can get Aiden Hutchinson at number 2 overall, like the Lions did. You don't want that. So how do you fix a roster problem when you don't want to finish with a 2-win season? You already wouldn't have the top pick, by the way. And I don't think anyone wants a brand new head coach to oversee a team that fails that much. In my mind, Bump, you either make some trades, mid-season trades to acquire talent, or you do this delicate balancing act of moving on from 1 or 2 pieces you already have, knowing that the risk inherent to that is you're trying to become more talented. So trading your best talent makes you less talented in the moment. It's a risk. You
look at the positions and places with the most talent and that you're paying the most money. And that is your piece of leverage. That's why many people on the text line right now are asking about DK. What are you going to do with him? I think you have to wait and see. Going off of last week, people are ready to get rid of DK. I go, all right, there's one bad game this season. Let's see how he progresses and how they feel at the end of the year with him. But you're right. You got to trade, and you got to make space during the offseason. That's why these guys on these 1-year deals, there's a chance that some of them don't come back.
That test.
You make some, right? You fail the test. You make some space, and you see what's out there. There's a bunch of different ways to do this, and those ways to do it all have to come together at the right time, and you get the right group. Easier said than done, right? But it's the hardest part about this is the trades at the trade deadline. That's the tough one, right? Because you're rolling the dice. You're taking a risk and saying, all right, maybe if we can get rid of this guy or trade for this guy, this will take us to the next level. How far do you think this team can go is going to be in question, too. If I'm sitting there and I'm John Schneider, I'm Mike Macdonald, you're sitting there hovering around 500, and you're looking at the team and say, we might win a few more games. I know Mike Macdonald, the coaching staff, go out there to win every single game. But when you're talking business, you got to speak in reality and say, okay, where is this team? Who are they really? And how do we match up against the best teams in the NFC? Because you got the Niners, who I think are going to make the playoffs. Mm-hmm. You got Detroit. You got the Vikings. I mean, Green Bay is a sneaky good team. The Bucs are picking up right now. So you got to compare who you are to those teams and say, can we really compete with those teams by just making a couple moves? That's the hardest thing about football. You're never just one or two guys away. Never. This ain't basketball. This ain't baseball. In football, you're like 5, 6, 7 guys away from really making something happen. So that's the tough part, are making the trades at the trade deadline and trying to decide what you're willing to sacrifice.
Speaking of what you're willing to sacrifice, that also applies to free agency. The Seahawks are in kind of a weird spot. So here are two things that are happening with this team, and were happening with this team heading into the season. The first is that they made a sacrifice. They took a risk at linebacker. We're going to go with guys who've been backups and only recently starters, or with guys who aren't really like Pro Bowlers or whatever. We're going to go with guys who are more untested than the two we're moving on from, because we'd rather spend with the defensive line. I don't know how many people, there were plenty of linebacker questions heading into the season, but I don't know how many people would have a huge problem with this team investing, in theory, in the defensive line. Everyone would have been like, great, fantastic. One of the critiques I always heard, you spent too much time trying to pay all these defensive backs and you aren't good enough up front. So John Schneider invested in the defensive line. It is the most money and the most draft capital that they've had in that group ever under John Schneider. I'm not necessarily overly critical of that decision. However, you did take a risk at linebacker, and you're bringing in a head coach where that position was really important in Baltimore to that success. The other thing that's going on is the amount of dead cap you have in safety right now with Jamal Adams and Quandre Diggs is probably hindering, and was probably hindering, your ability to either add to that linebacker group in free agency or add to the offensive line in free agency. So I'm going to throw in just buying talent as a way to address this if you don't want to have a horrible season and a number 2 overall pick.
All the good teams buy talent.
Yeah.
That's what they do. You draft your core members, right? Your Patrick Mahomes, your Travis Kelce's, and then the Humphreys go over there too, right? And then you go out and you buy your talent. But it's all about the right combinations, right? And when you are buying talent, it is all a risk. And I think that I look at this team, and I think most people would agree that if you went out and spent the majority of your money on the offseason, on offensive line and defensive line, you'll win a couple more games just with that alone as well, because the talent on the perimeter is good to go. Still waiting to see how the linebackers perform at the rest of the year. They've had some good games. They've had some bad games. That's the reality of that position at this point. But their performance is also affected by the guys in front of them. If they can't be clean, then you can't expect them to do much. But it's definitely a roster thing right now. But it's also up to the coaches to get the most out of this roster. How are you going to change the way you teach things or your scheme a little bit? I'm not saying throw the 3-4 out and Mike Macdonald's defense doesn't work. False. We've seen it work on multiple levels, but he had the guys to execute that defense. So now what does he do to put them in better positions? Offensively, how are you coaching this offensive line up? Because there are some things I'm going to talk about in 4 down where I'm like, if they just do this, these runs are going to hit, because you got Ken Walker in the backfield. So it's always a combination, man. It's the roster, it's the coaching adjustments, and it's the